Hey there. You're listening to episode 190 of the Finish Line podcast, where we discuss the intersection of faith, generosity, and personal finance. My name is Cody, and I'm here with my co-host and brother, Keelan. What does it look like to invest with a posture of surrender? Today's guest is Patrick Farrell, co-founder of Keystone Investing, an investing community helping faith-driven investors align their capital with their convictions. Patrick is helping people think differently about what it means to invest with wisdom, intentionality, and surrender. In this conversation, we explore his story, the heart behind Keystone, and why community matters so much when you're trying to live generously. If you want to think more deeply about stewardship, investing, and surrender, stay tuned. Before we get started, we've spent years speaking to and learning from some of the most passionate givers and leaders in the world. We've distilled down some of the most impactful frameworks, strategies, and tools into short weekly emails that leave you with practical ways you can take your generosity journey to the next level. If you're not on the list already, you can sign up for free at finishlinepledge.com. And with that, let's get to the interview. Well, we're here today with Patrick Farrell. Patrick, thank you so much for taking some time to join us.
Man, so excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
So take us back to your early childhood years and tell us a little bit about what life looked like growing up.
Yeah, totally. So I was born in Northern Virginia, and my family moved to Chicago shortly afterwards and then came back. So then I spent the rest of my early childhood years, middle school years, and high school years in Northern Virginia. So I'm a diehard Washington sports fan, for better or for worse, mostly for worse. But my parents, when I was born, were not believers, not walking with Jesus. My mom came to know the Lord when I was probably 6 or 7, and my dad several years after that when I was in middle school. So I grew up in sort of like a pseudo-Christian home. I can remember a time when Christ wasn't at the center of it, but then I also remember watching my parents' transformation and how that shifted our household in a lot of different ways. My dad was an entrepreneur and worked in software. My mom was a stay-at-home mom who eventually became a women's Bible study teacher. And so kind of had an interesting blend there from the beginning. I have a younger sister named Haley, who's an absolute rock star and blows me out of the water in most categories in terms of like intellect and career success and all sorts of good stuff like that. But I'm the oldest of two, so I was the oldest son. And my family was in a upper class neighborhood. My father was successful and was able to provide financially, and that gave me opportunities to have access to schools, programs, things like that were exceptional, and that really challenged me and grew me. And so I'm super thankful for the ways he did that. And so, we were in the Northern Virginia area up until I left for college. And overall loving home, came to know the Lord when I was in high school. And so just was able to have a really highly positive experience. Parents are still together today. There's a lot that I'm super thankful for in my early childhood years.
Patrick, can you tell us a little bit more about what that season looked like in high school when your faith really became your own?
100%. In middle school, I hit more of a rebellious streak. And at that point in time, I was really seeking all sorts of things outside of what I think God would have had for me, that I was seeking to find something that was going to satisfy me or really fulfill my life. And so that's what kind of led to a lot of the rebellion. And so my mom would make us go to youth group. But when I got there, I was really I was respectful, but I was sneaking out. I was doing things I shouldn't do. And I was smart enough to be able to make something up around what the pastor had said when I was challenged. But it just didn't resonate with me. As I continued to grow, a lot of that loneliness, a lot of that pain started to continue to come up, and I just felt very empty. And so if I'm being really honest, my freshman year, me and a buddy of mine were thinking about going to the winter retreat with the youth group because we had a set of girls that were supposed to go that we wanted to go meet and hang out with. And those girls didn't end up showing up, but we had already committed. So I show up to this thing. I'm so bummed that I'm there. But I ended up listening to the message, mainly because of the position that I was in, just feeling really empty, and also all those girls that didn't show up. And the pastor was talking a lot about satisfaction and Jesus being all satisfying. And I started to listen. And by Sunday morning, I was on my knees in the front of the room, giving my life to Jesus. And that really turned around my high school experience in a lot of ways, because I then was really committed and all in on, reading my Bible, showing up to youth group, all of those different pieces of the puzzle. So that was really the beginning of my faith journey, was having that encounter with Jesus at a youth retreat. And then that just started to define a lot of my high school experience after that.
I was laughing as you were sharing that. I can't tell you how many people I have heard have a similar coming to Jesus moment of I was at this retreat, or I was in this youth group trying to meet this girl or this guy, and that didn't work out, but I met Jesus instead. That's a pretty good consolation prize.
Yeah, I'd say so.
I'd love to hear, during this same season of life, middle school, high school, college even, what were some of the messages that you were internalizing about money, success, work, and some of the rhythms around those, either from your parents or just from the world and your experiences? What did you believe success looked like in that stage?
Totally. And I'm sure we'll see some of these threads like woven throughout my story, and just ways that God's still working in my heart, like today, years and years later. Well, the first thing about money, as I mentioned, I grew up in an upper class family, and my dad was insanely generous. That's one of the things that everyone who's met him will say about him. And so I grew up very fortunately with this view of like, there is plenty and there's no reason to hold on to it tightly. For instance, I think it was the second or third company that my father sold, he gave 50% of his profits to charity. And so I grew up with an example of like, this is what it's like. You're generous to others. There's a story that kind of defines this. I went to Mark Batterson's church called National Community Church in Washington, D.C. And so he writes about this for like a page or two in his book, Double Blessing. But my father had really felt compelled that education was a key to kind of stepping up and growing and being able to be successful. And a lot of my cousins didn't come from means. And so he would often pay for some, most, or all of my cousins' college experiences. And when I was applying to college, I went to Vanderbilt University. And there's kind of a cool story about how I like kind of on a whim haphazardly applied for a scholarship at Vandy. And then months later, got a full tuition scholarship. From my perspective in this story, by the way, it was called a Dean's Award Scholarship. And there was not a single other person at Vanderbilt that I met that had the same scholarship. The dean never reached out. There was no requirements. It just showed up out of nowhere and disappeared out of thin air. You couldn't apply for it. The scholarship that I applied for was not the one that I received. So it was a total gift from God, and it was really his way of getting me to Vanderbilt. But when my dad and my parents totaled up how much they had given to my cousins to help them go to college and how much that scholarship had saved them, it was like within a couple $1,000s of the total. And so God had totally just given it all back. Now in Mark's book, and if you ever listen to this, I'm giving you some crap on this. He talks all about my parents' generosity, but he talks nothing about Patrick's like good grades and GPA and like my great test scores. I don't show up at all in the story. It's just my parents' generosity, but I guess that's okay. That's the moral of the story. So anyways, I grew up with a lot of really positive messages around generosity. As it relates to success, one of the things my dad always said was, you can do anything you put your mind to. And I think that had a very positive side to it, which was it gave me an internal locus of control. I index really highly on responsibility, self-confidence, go out there and do it. And a lot of that was really very, very helpful in school and also in my career. But I think there's also a flip side to that where, and we can talk about this more in my story too, where it had me lean pretty heavily into performance and achievement. If I can do anything I put my mind to, then I can control the outcomes of my life. And so when I fail, or I fail to work hard enough or achieve, what does that say about who I am and my identity and whether I can feel approved or loved or affirmed? And so the dark side and the flip side of that teaching of success and the environment that I was in was that it was very highly performative. I went to one of the best academic schools in Virginia, Vanderbilt. That's a highly competitive, talented environment, and where a lot of those messages were reinforced for me. So for better or for worse, it helped me build me into a skillful, resourceful person. But on the flip side, performance definitely had its teeth in me from an early age.
So Patrick, after graduation, what did your early career look like? What were you aiming for, and how did that start to play out in your life?
Yeah, totally. So At Vanderbilt, it's like you're either a doctor, a consultant, or an investment banker. At least back then, that was the three main paths that you would take. And so I picked the consulting path. I had worked at startups in college and really enjoyed them. But I felt like for my first role, I wanted something stable. I wanted to try my hand in the consulting world. So I came back to DC, got a job with Booz Allen Hamilton, and started there. And I quickly learned that I was not built for corporate. And I was definitely not built for the government. I just wanted to move faster. I wanted less rules and less red tape. I met some really great people there to help grow my early career and just put those sort of foundational pieces in where you can really build on. So I'm super thankful for that time, but that just wasn't going to be a long-term fit. And so after that, I jumped back into startups. My dad was starting a cybersecurity company about 2 years out of college, and I joined as a founding team member. And that was my foray back into startups and really the stepping stone prior to launching Keystone Investing.
Yeah, so take us through some of the initial launch of Keystone. Where did that idea, that genesis come from? And what was God doing at that time to start to plant the seeds for what He's ultimately done through Keystone today?
Totally. I'll pick up right where I kind of left off the story and fill in a little bit of the gaps. So after that kind of conversion experience in high school, I went hard into the youth group, hard into following my faith. But by the end of high school, I honestly, along the lines of this performance driven thing that was within me, I started to burn out on faith. I had watched a lot of my friends walk away. I've never felt like I could really get to the point where I was comfortable in my faith. And so I started to kind of burn out on it. I had some experiences with some church leaders that were somewhat negative, while also there were some church leaders that were really kind to me and really amazing. And I owe a lot to. There were still some of those negative church experiences. And so when I got to college, I think I said, I believe in Jesus, but I don't want to be around the people that follow him. And so that took me down a completely different path. And surely sooner rather than later, my life stopped really reflecting my faith. I was just kind of living like the world was. And the Lord still blessed a lot of those experiences and built some great friendships that I have left today and had some great experiences. And he really was really kind to me during that period of time. But when I joined the cybersecurity startup that my dad had started, my life just was not reflecting any of my faith. My dad's business partner, his name was Todd. We had a great working relationship, and he realized that I believed in Jesus, but my life wasn't aligned with the kingdom. And so he started discipling me and mentoring me in a business context, which was really amazing because I don't think I would have gone back to church, but I had to go to work every, Monday through Friday. He had built some good trust with me, and God started to meet me in really crazy ways in the office space. So we'd sit there, we'd pray together, and I would see things, hear things, feel things. God would literally meet me, like the Holy Spirit would meet me in an office space on 2 p.m. on a Tuesday. And so through that experience, through praying and being discipled by him, my life started to shift and rearrange, and my heart changed. And I really felt a connection back with the Lord, and my life started to kind of align with that. And so that experience in the business really inspired me to say, man, God's not constrained to the four walls of the church. He wants to meet people wherever they're at in their vocation. And then the second thing I learned during that experience, well, by the way, the cybersecurity company, I was the director of corporate development. So we had a growth by acquisition strategy, a wealthy family office that was behind us. And so we did some bolt-ons. That gave me the deal making bug. Once we had those companies in-house, we had to integrate them. So I moved over to director of operations, people, processes, and systems to scale the business. That gave me this, reinforced my startup bug. And I had this third piece that was faith. But one of the things that I experienced in that startup, we eventually had an exit in 2020, which was amazing to have one of those in my 20s and be able to see a venture from beginning to end. But one of the things that I also learned and felt really high conviction on was that God is using ventures to build people primarily. And then as a result, the spiritual and emotional health of the founding team is essential to a venture's success. All of those spiritual wounds, all those emotional wounds that us as leaders that we carry with us, they will flow through our organization. And unless we face up to them, our organizations and our people will suffer. And I had this strong conviction of that leaving that business. And so I wanted to try to find a way to support entrepreneurs to build businesses like the one I was a part of, and to do so in a way that helped build them up as people. And so I tried a few things. A lot of stuff didn't work. and eventually landed on an angel network as a model for sort of relational investing. There are few people within a founder's life that have more access to them than their investors. So I felt like this was a way to build relationships with founders, to do something that's meaningful to them, because it's either, I'm raising money or I'm growing revenue. Like those are the two things that are always on the top of a founder's mind. And so it was a way to get in a relationship with them, do something meaningful for them, but then also a way to kind of build them up as people. And so that's how the whole thing started.
So during this time, it sounds like you were learning a lot about yourself and your gifts and your preferences, and you didn't want to be in a more corporate environment. You wanted to be in a more entrepreneurial environment, and you loved making deals happen and being part of that. And you also understood that there was a lot of money to be made by everyone when this is done well. I'm curious, as you were getting to know Jesus better, how was he showing you the differences between the way that capital normally flows through these types of networks, so angel investing and venture capital, versus what you were being discipled into?
Great question. The first thing that comes to mind is, I think when we look at the way that capital typically moves, it's typically two things. Well, at its worst, it's extractive, right? It's, hey, as an investor, I'm looking to maximize my financial ROI, such to the extent that I don't care what gets broken in the process. Now, let's hope that, as my friends at Praxis say, as Christians, we've moved more from that extractive, exploitative mindset to a more ethical one. But we know that that exists in the world, and that there's always a temptation to revert back to, what am I getting out of this, at the expense of people, at the expense of systems, at the expense of whatever that might look like. But I think ultimately that transactional posture was just so clear to me that that was just not God's heart, right? Like God had been kind and patient with me while I was kind of on my wayward path doing all sorts of different things. And he met me relationally in ways that shifted my heart. And I just had a strong conviction as I read the Gospels, as I was kind of relearning my faith, that God cares about relationships more than really anything else. And so anything that we set up from a business perspective that deprioritizes relationship tends to fall victim to our sinful nature, or it degrades in ways that really have impact on people and communities and nations in our globe. And so as Jesus was shifting my heart, he was really shifting it from transaction to relationship. And what does it mean to prioritize that? And that is kind of the bedrock of some of the things that we've been building on at Keystone.
So walk us through, like, practically or functionally, what is unique about the Keystone model in terms of the day-to-day or operationally. How do you build these more kind of theoretical concepts into where the rubber meets the road?
Yeah, so just at a high level, Keystone Investing, we're a community of faith-driven investors actively aligning our capital with our values. And how we do that is really by building communities of faith-driven investors in locality, meeting monthly, and then sharing high quality and alternative investment opportunities with that group that align with our values. As Keystone, we are both the investing service. So we go find the deals, present them to our investors, help our investors evaluate them, and then eventually invest in them. We also support a lot of our portfolio founders. So we're kind of like the investing service in a lot of ways, although our investors are making individual decisions whether to invest or not. But then also we are the ones who are pulling the relationships into the community, hosting the events, helping facilitate some of those connections. So just as a backdrop, that's kind of who we are. And so our unique model is we really started with the Angel Network model, which is basically our members pay us an annual fee to be a part of the network, and we go kind of create a forum to facilitate all of this activity. What was unique about the way that we started is most angel networks start with a group of investors who want to do deals together, and they just kind of find a way to build a process and find deals and write checks together. It was a little different in that I said, hey, I actually think there's an opportunity here to build this community in DC and to do redemptive investing in a way that we don't have anything else locally or really on the East Coast at that time. So I want to put all of my weight behind it. I want to make this my entrepreneurial project, and we'll just see where it goes. So one differentiator was just putting my full weight behind it and saying, this is what I want to expend my time on. That helped accelerate a lot. The second thing was that because I was putting my full time behind it, and I later somewhat regretted this, but now I very much appreciate it, is we decided we were going to meet monthly. And I was going to present deals monthly to my investors. Well, most angel networks meet quarterly or sometimes semi-annually. And so to be able to have to present monthly deal flow meant I had to go find enough quality deals. I had to be helpful in my helping investors evaluate them and invest in them because we were turning a much faster flywheel, but it also meant that we were hosting monthly events in person in locality. And that's what really, whether we were, somewhat intentionally stepped into that or kind of stumbled into it, or the Lord had his grace over us, that was one of the key pieces, is that we realized that that local, in-person, consistent feel started to build the community that we were looking for, because people were meeting each other and getting into spaces together on a monthly basis and getting to know each other way faster than they would have if we had just said, hey, we're going to do deals every quarter. And so those were some of the unique ways we started to build. Since then, obviously, there's been a ton of moments we can talk about today, but that was the bedrock and the foundation to kind of our unique model and what we've built today.
Patrick, I'm curious, where did you begin in terms of actually building a network? How did you know who to reach out to? What were you looking for? Or did that kind of form throughout time?
Well, I was blessed enough to have a set of connections through my work at Nehemiah Security was the name of the cybersecurity company. Through my work at Nehemiah, and then also just being in the local ecosystem. And then some of my early members, I think there was 5 of them. One was my parents, right? And then one was my spiritual father and mentor, Todd, who I mentioned. And then there was a handful of others, including Bill and Dana Wichterman, who you've had on the podcast, I believe, that just were like, yeah, I think we'd love to see this locally. Like, we'll take a chance on you. So it started with 5 families. And then once I started building the flywheel, it was a lot of business development, whether it was with founders trying to find deals or with investors who I thought would be a good fit. I was just meeting anybody I possibly could. And so those early years were like hours and hours of connections. And hey, if you know somebody, let me know. Or you meet a connection, try to have them introduce you to other people. And I was just really trying to build that flywheel. And that's how the network started to kind of build. But I think the key piece to that is that, again, I wasn't approaching it from like a networking perspective. Like, hey, who do I know? And what can I get out of them? I was approaching it from like, hey, we want to be relational, and let's find people who align with who we are and are compelled by our mission. And then let's get to know them. And whether that's entrepreneurs, investors, or just ecosystem partners, or random people who have really nothing to do with what we're up to, let's just try to build it that way. And so it was slow at first. That starts to compound over time. The more quality connections you make and people that you end up serving along the way, it started to build a good cultural reputation for what we were doing. That is, again, started to compound over time.
I'd love to hear, especially during those initial years where there's a lot of unknowns, a lot of uncertainty, what was going on the personal side, especially spiritually? Because you talked about having kind of built up some renewed foundation of faith during your time at Nehemiah, but then it's a whole new, ball game on your own, with a lot more kind of moving parts and a lot more riding on performance and things like that. What was God doing in your heart at that time? What kind of things or ideas or aspirations did you have to kind of lay on the table at God's feet? And what else was going on that side?
Well, I remember near the end of my time at Nehemiah, the cybersecurity company, I remember I was going on a walk and I felt like the Lord told me, like, this season is over. You're entering a new one. And I remember thinking, oh, amazing, this last season. And there was some things I hadn't talked about that were really painful at the end of that season, just some relational brokenness and some tough things I had to work through. And at the end of that season, I was like, oh, shifting seasons, great. Like, let's get out of this one. I've learned a lot. I've changed a lot. Let's get into something like more towards flourishing. But the analogy I would give is that when God frees the Israelites from Egypt, he takes them into the desert. And that actually was my experience. I thought by launching a company that it was going to be, all up and to the right and exciting and fun. And the model that we had chosen, as I mentioned, it was unique and it was different, but it's incredibly difficult to pull off and highly labor intensive. And by the way, not that profitable. And so I was struggling financially to start off with. I was working a lot. I felt like the progress was really slow. And I felt like God had kind of walked me into what I would consider was the beginning of a desert period where I, for the first time in my life, felt a sense of scarcity around my capital, around my time, around my energy, around my relationships. By the way, when I started the company, that's 6 months after the start of COVID, basically, around that time, or that's when I started kind of seeking to see what I was going to do. We started in January 2022. So there's a process there. But when when the cybersecurity company sold in August 2020, that was the start of my journey. And I was living in DC at the time, which was under kind of heavy lockdowns. I was living on my own. And so it really did start what ended up being a desert period. And what I've learned is I thought that we were going to be in the business of spiritually forming and building entrepreneurs. But I didn't realize that God had to take me through my own process and is continuing to do that in me today. And what I get to learn, I then get to share with entrepreneurs and investors. And so, frankly, it was a kind of rough several years where really I didn't feel like I had enough financially. I didn't feel like I had enough in terms of time and energy. And really what the Lord was breaking during that time was that performance mindset. It felt like no matter how hard I worked, no matter how good I formed and shaped things, I was not seeing the results that I wanted. And it started to really break that performance. And I had to start to learn how to rest in the Lord, how to lay things down and surrender. Surrender was not a term that I had in my repertoire prior to entrepreneurship. And folks who have started a company, everybody knows it's like, man, this is a lot harder than media seems to make it look. And so I was facing a lot of those challenges. And the Lord really started to break that down to try to break that performance so he could recenter me on his love and his provision. And so that was what was going on in the early days, with some serious spiritual changes.
Patrick, I want to tie back to these early childhood experiences of seeing the generosity of your parents through the way that they managed finances, but also in other areas of their lives. As you are going through this period and this performance-based identity is being replaced, how did you see your role as a spiritual guide to entrepreneurs and investors that you would be working with?
Yeah, great question. And by the way, that journey, maybe I'm a knucklehead or maybe it just takes me longer sometimes, but it was a years long journey with a bunch of different inflection points. So it didn't happen overnight, and it's still happening, right? It's still happening 5 years later, 6 years later. So how has it changed my mindset as it relates to serving my customers and serving entrepreneurs? I think at the end of the day, one of the big things that has been broken off of me is when we're doing it in our own power, then when good things happen, we think that we earned them, instead of understanding that, especially like one of the key passages for me has been Deuteronomy 6, which is like, you're in Deuteronomy. Why is that a key passage for you? It's because as God is about to lead his people into the promised land, he says, don't forget that when the rains come and you have all of these amazing things and all of these resources, don't forget that it was I, the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt. You were slaves in Egypt. I brought you out. I've covenanted with you, and I have brought you into the promised land. I've provided all of these things. And we kind of skip over it. Or we're just like, yeah, of course, God, like, I know that you're the provider of all things. But when you have to kind of lay down that performance, you realize that it's really his provision. And so in that sort of surrendering posture, which I'm not perfect at, but when in that surrendering posture, I was able to kind of see maybe more clearly how God was working in different situations, and able to kind of let go of outcomes and more just focus on the relationships and the inputs even deeper than I had before. So one kind of example of that is when you build a business, you're thinking about sales. And although I had taken a relational approach to my investors, there's a lot of times where I was having conversations with high net worth individuals or accredited investors and trying to sell them on what Keystone was and why they should be a part of it, when really it was apparent for some of those folks that Keystone just wasn't a good fit for where they were at. And me serving them actually would have been more like me telling them, hey, actually, you're not a good fit for this. I think you're looking for something else, or just recognizing when like the values were slightly misaligned, that would have been detrimental to our community, versus pushing forward and just saying, hey, we just need more membership. And so that was like a big way in which my heart posture changed. The other piece is just to be open to where the Lord wanted to lead the business. So if it's in your own performance, you're always strategizing, you're always putting the pieces together, you're always thinking about the next steps. And honestly, we would not have gotten to where we are today if the Lord hadn't started changing things, so that I'd be open to when he would make a crazy strategic move. The biggest example of that is we always thought we were going to be in DC. We were going to build deep in DC. And I had a friend and an advisor and an investor of ours named Henry Kastner. Henry is the founder of Sovereign's Capital. He's the founder of Faith Driven Investor. And we were having a conversation about this kind of unique model we had built in DC. And he looked at me dead in the eye and he said, there should be a Keystone Investing in every city in the United States. And it was like the Holy Spirit was tapping me on the shoulder. Like, hey, you should really listen to that. And that's what led me to feel called to move to Austin, and then eventually launched the Austin chapter. And then we launched in St. Louis. We never would have thought about a multi-city model if I hadn't been surrendered and open to like however the Lord was going to move and use the business. And so he's tremendously blessed that. But if it's in our own power, if it's in our own performance, we're going to make some plans and they're probably going to fail no matter how good they look on paper.
Patrick, you talked about those early days of trying to find deals every single month, but also your original desire to help investors align their financial resources with their values. What did you learn about actually finding investments that could align well with the values of the investors you were working with?
So our thesis to begin with was very simple: people, purpose, and profit. We thought that we could have our cake and eat it too, which meant we want to find excellent values-aligned founders building intentional, mission-driven businesses that are heading towards sustainability and profitability and growth and scale. And at the time, a lot of people, and it's slowly changing today, had this idea that all those things were like in conflict with each other. That like if you're investing aligned with the kingdom, your returns are going to stink, or the excellence of the founders is not going to be up to par. Or if I'm investing in something that's going to be financially flourishing, then it's going to be devoid of mission and devoid of impact. And I think our thesis was like, no, we think that we can find all three. And God has provided a ton of amazing entrepreneurs that we've either deals that we've evaluated and then also companies we've invested in, which is almost 30 now, where that we feel like fit those three profiles. Now, the return profile isn't always, 100x. Sometimes it's a little bit less, and the impact isn't always above and beyond, but we've found that sort of balance. And so that was our thesis to start with. And what we've found in the deal flow process is that exists. So one of our things that we've been trying to kind of show investors is like faith-driven investing can be excellent. It can be excellent for people. It can be excellent for the impact that it will have on people or the world at large. And it can be excellent financially. You don't have to sacrifice those things. And I think that has been a key piece of kind of shifting some of our investors' mentality as it relates to what does it mean to be a faith-driven investor, or what does faith-driven investing look like? I think the second thing we learned as we were building this thing is that like God is using ventures to work on people, God is using investing to work on investors. That actually this entire process of faith-driven investing is all about, are you growing in intimacy with the Lord? And is he changing and shifting your heart? And are you partnering with him to put the world back together and use your finances accordingly? That's what real stewardship is. And so one of the things we were kind of running into is, again, and that performance mindset showing up, like this real desire to do well with our finances, this real desire to have impact, but then not recognizing that like, if you're not on a journey with Jesus throughout the whole process, then what's the point? You can make a ton of money, you can have a ton of impact, but if you're not transformed and the people around you aren't transformed, then that falls short of what I think God's goal was. So now that I'm responding, I feel like I didn't really answer your question, but those were some of the things we were working on early on that we've been learning as we've grown, as it related to kind of what we were seeing investors think about that we were hoping to shift.
Yeah, that number of interesting things that you brought up there. I want to come back to this kind of balance, or really kind of, I guess, a gradient between risk, financial return, and impact, kingdom impact, or on the people in the company itself, kind of, I guess, lumping all that together. And I've seen various kind of visualizations of this kind of balance at different ways that investors kind of think through it. But it seems like there's like pretty different profiles in terms of how much you kind of push the scale on each of these different categories. I'd love to hear how you think through the balance of those. If there's a particular profile within that kind of fits Keystone well, or if it really is just investor dependent, what kind of capital they're using and what their goals are, their season of life, all of that. How do you think through those, and also just thinking through the different people listening and, the types of capital they might be trying to steward and think through on their own?
Yeah. As I mentioned prior, part of our thesis is really dialing in on the fact that you don't necessarily have to sacrifice returns in order to see kingdom impact. You don't have to sacrifice excellence to see kingdom impact. And so I think one of the things that we exist to do, now there are a lot of other companies that are investing in maybe different categories that would see things differently, where they're prioritizing impact to the extent that they're finding opportunities that might have lower financial return or something along those lines. But for us, the sort of mission that I kind of felt called to was for high net worth individuals and accredited investors, can we give them alternative investment opportunities that grow their financial pot and also have impact and are relational in nature? So to answer your question, for me, the balance is there is no balance. They're not in conflict with each other. That being said, there are obviously opportunities wherein the risk and the reward don't add up. So for instance, the best easy example is international investing. You often don't understand the context, but there are political forces or economic forces that can cause destabilization. That increases the risk factor. You can have an excellent founder with a mission-driven business and a profitable business plan, but when you put it in those contexts, the risks increase. And so to that extent, I think, and to your point about the different profiles of people, this is why stewardship is a journey with Jesus, to learn more about yourself and him and where he's calling you in the process. If you miss that, then you're going to miss whether Jesus might be calling you to take insane risk or very little risk. And so I think risk is where it becomes very unique and individual. I've met investors who are like, hey, where God is calling me right now is to just grow this pot of generosity. And so I'm just sticking with the basics and growing things in a way that I think is values aligned. And I'm just giving and giving and giving. That's great. The folks that are most confident in that and most impactful in that have gone on a journey with Jesus to figure that out. I've also met with folks who are like, hey, I'm called to invest in the hardest places to reach for the gospel with businesses as mission that will almost all likely fail. We're going to invest way more in that risky category than any secular investor would advise us to do. The thing is, you just don't get there unless you've been spiritually formed in a journey and in a process. And so I think risk and risk appetite is really depends on a lot of different factors. But here's what I would say. Ultimately, it depends on less about your stage of life, less about your interests, less about how you see your portfolio going. And the number one priority is, where does God want to steward his finances? This is not yours, it's his. And so if we're taking risk and we're thinking, oh, this is where I'm comfortable, most of the time, not always, but most of the time, in my experience, God's going to push us into more and greater risk to help us rely on him, for him to show off his power and his glory. So I would say that risk is the key, unique and individual factor in kind of where we're called to invest. But oftentimes, I think we're called to be more risk tolerant than we would be comfortable doing.
Patrick, I've thought a lot about the dynamics of both giving and investing from a heart of generosity. And Keelan and I talk about this pretty regularly and get to hear different perspectives through this podcast. But I think setting a financial finish line is what allowed me to actually become more surrendered in how I managed God's finances and truly not just see things differently, but actually behave differently in how I carried that out. But also, I kind of started off my generosity journey with a heavy emphasis on giving. And I saw investing as a way that I would just accumulate not just financial resources, but a sense of control, like this illusion that I could control more if I had more wealth. It took me a while, like you were saying, this journey of actually breaking it down and saying, okay, if I'm truly surrendered, if this is truly God's resources, he's entrusting them to me. What's important to God first, like looking to scripture, what are the things on God's heart? But then also, what is he uniquely calling me into? And there are some things that giving is arguably much more effective at, and there are others that investing is much more effective at. And if we can look at that objectively and say, instead of I insist on my way, what's going to fit in my box, saying, where is God leading me? And what's the best way to actually approach that? I think that's how I've come to approach it. And so it's not that we all have to be all in on one thing, but as we steward resources and give resources, understanding how to do both to God's glory. And I think that's been really helpful for me to unpack over the last few years. Instead of saying, I'm investing no matter what, or I'm giving no matter what, and I just have to find avenues for it. It's just totally flipped it on its head for me.
Totally. Man, well, I love that journey that you've been on. And I think it's akin to what I see happening in a lot of our investors' lives. Oftentimes that at the beginning of that process, they're either skewed one way or they have a preference towards generosity or investing. And they may have a lot of problems that they care about or just a few. And just to watch how some of those things change over time. I mean, one of the big things we see when we see new investors and they're like, man, I really want to integrate my faith with my investing. But like all of these deals you're showing me look really good and they all have these impacts that I care about all of these things. Like, how will I know what to invest in? And often you see folks start to come up with over time and experience and relationship with other investors and seeing founders, they come up with a thesis, right? Around like, hey, maybe God's calling me to shift the needle here, or maybe God's calling me all in on foster care, or maybe I'm all in on minority founders, no matter what the industry is. It changes from person to person. And here's the unique and beautiful thing about the journey you've been on, Cody, is that you probably feel more active and more alive because it's more aligned with who you were made to be and who God made you to be. And so when you're doing your giving and your investing now, it's not only that your strategy has changed, it's that it's more in line with like who you were made to be. And therefore you're reflecting God's image in a unique and beautiful way. And so I think that's the key, is that folks don't realize that as they learn and build a thesis around their giving and their investing, they'll learn more how to do so in a way that creates joy for them and creates joy for the Lord.
Patrick, on that topic, can you think of examples of either investors or founders that you have journeyed with that have kind of discovered how God has uniquely made them, and that has had an impact on the way that they invest and carry out building business?
One I think of, I don't know why the Spirit's bringing him to mind. Well, I do, because he's amazing, but he's actually not a part of Keystone, but he's an investor that we've co-invested with a ton. His name is Tom Blaisdell. He's on the West Coast. He's in Silicon Valley. He is just so clear about what his thesis is, which is really around fintech and around kind of minority founders. In the venture capital space, oftentimes, especially on the West Coast, what you'll see is really what they call a spray and pray strategy. I'm going to invest in 100 deals. I'm going to write small checks to everybody. And because of diversification, that'll create returns. And because a lot of these companies will fail, that's how I kind of diversify in order to avoid risk. Tom has kind of done the absolute opposite, where he has invested a lot of money into a few startups and just poured all of his time and energy and capital into it. In some ways, to the world, it makes no sense. But to the founders, he's meant the world. And so all of the companies that we've co-invested with him in, the founders just speak so highly of like his sacrificial posture, the way he's gone about it, the ways in which he's blessed them, the ways in which he's gone above and beyond financially or otherwise to help them. Man, it's like, that's somebody who understands what their calling is, what their thesis is, and how to have an outsized impact. And he's doing so in a way that's sort of countercultural, at least counter modern wisdom. So Tom comes to mind as like a great person to think about that. And then there's so many founders that we've partnered with, that I've been on the journey with for a long time. And I've just seen God transform them. One that comes to mind is my buddy Vineet Rajan. Vineet's up in Columbia, Maryland, near you guys. Runs a company called Forte. It's a B2B SaaS model that is really a mental fitness company. It helps companies reach their employees where they're at work and help them stay healthy emotionally and spiritually so that they can go back to work and do well at their jobs. Because we all know we bring our personal stuff into our work. And just watching Vineet, him and I started our companies around the same time. He was the first investment we ever did at Keystone. So he kind of helped me kind of launch Keystone as our first deal. And we've been kind of walking together for now 5 or 6 years, and just watching him and the ways in which God has built and shaped him and helped him make hard decisions. That dude has made so many hard decisions that didn't make sense at the time, but just watching that his spiritual maturity get to that point has been such a blessing. And I hope I've blessed him because he's been along for my journey as well. But one story, actually, Tom was an investor in Vineet's company. And I know I'm kind of droning on here, but it's kind of interesting because you chose the two of them. And then there's a story about the two of them. Vineet was working a deal with a huge corporate company and was going to be able to kind of come in from the top down and have access to their hundreds of thousands of employees. It would have been a game-changing multi-million-dollar deal for the company. And him and Tom went and sat in the boardroom of this company and just felt like it wasn't alignment, it wasn't the right timing, that it just wasn't a deal that they thought was good for the company. And they together decided to say no to this multi-million-dollar opportunity early in the company's life cycle. Painful moment, I'm sure. It wasn't like the next deal came the next day. It was years before they struck up a partnership of that size and scale and power. And they had to kind of make that sacrificial move. But I don't know how you make that move unless you're surrendered to the Lord, you're in a process with him, and you care about things that are bigger than just the financial bottom line. And so the two of them are examples of folks that I've seen just like on the journey and how that can impact the way that you run your business and the way that you impact people around you.
Yeah, and that's a great example of how important the relationships and the people, the community, making that decision with somebody is so much better than trying to figure it out on your own. So as you've been talking, I've just been kind of thinking through the fact that with investments and really any kind of stewardship decision, there's the external impact of, does this create flourishing in the world? What does it create in the world? But there's also, which you've spoken to many times already, how it affects you personally and spiritually, especially. And there's an unbelievable number of passages in the Bible that speak to the dangers of wealth and the competition of wealth, money, resources for our hearts in drawing our focus away from Christ. And I'd love to just focus on that aspect for a second. If you're speaking to somebody just kind of getting into the faith-driven investing space, what are the blind spots or the roadblocks to be aware of on a spiritual heart level as somebody seeks to grow capital and to have an external impact? Where do they need to watch and be careful of so that they're not doing so at their own expense, in a sense?
Yeah. Well, I'll talk about two. The first one is, you see this thread line in my story and in the conversation we've had, is really anything around performance and transaction. That, I think, for most investors, they've likely become successful because they've been high achievers, builders. A lot of these folks come into investing with the mindset of an entrepreneur, and a successful one at that. And I think that performance-oriented blind spot can do two things to us. One, it can make it about what we're getting out of it, or whether or not these opportunities are having extremely positive financial ROI versus seeing a holistic picture. We've talked a little bit about that. You can make it more transactional. I give you this money, you give it. It can change the relational dynamics. I think we've talked about that pretty significantly. But it also can hinder that journey with God that is about intimacy and learning about who we are and how to become a joyous, generous steward. If it's all about performance, it will hinder that. And I've also, frankly, seen it hinder risk profile, because Christians, by and large, are more risk adverse than the broader population, in my opinion, and what I've seen. And part of that is because we're so worried that, like, what if we mess up? What if I lose this money? Oh my God, God's going to be so upset with me. And a lot of the passages that folks will mention is like the parable of the talents, right? Oh my God, the steward buried his talent, and then God got really mad at him. But if you read the passage, what God got mad at was really that the steward didn't trust that he was a good and kind and fair master. And so he hid his talent because he was worried about retribution. And the master is upset that the steward thought of him that way. And so I think it leads us to be more risk adverse if we're oriented towards performance, because we're going to want to hold on to those things because we're worried about what will happen. The second thing that I would say is probably something that most wouldn't think of, which is that I think that shared faith is a indicator of shared interests between people in a relationship. And it can also be an indicator of trust. I think when you meet someone who's a Christian, you're more likely to trust them quickly than if you were just to meet somebody off the street. The problem is, as James talks about, like, faith without works is dead. And we see a lot of people, everyone knows somebody or has encountered somebody who claims to be a Christian and just does not act like it. And so I think for faith-driven investors, one of the big pitfalls is they get really excited about this space and they get really trusting and their expectations go way up. And then they invest in somebody without really building a relationship and a foundation of trust, vetting them like they would anything else, being diligent and wise about who they're investing in. And then their expectations get crushed. And they're like, oh my gosh, losing money on something secular, at least I would expect that sort of behavior from someone who's not following Jesus. But for something to go disastrous with somebody who I trusted and who shared my faith, it ends up impacting their hearts brutally and can sometimes push them away from the journey that God wants them to be on. And so I would say for new faith-driven investors getting in, over trusting is a big problem. And so I think it comes down to how can you vet somebody and understand who they are and that their actions and their values are aligned with their faith. Shameless plug, how do you get into a community of investors who are experienced and see your blind spots and help you think through what you're doing? How do you build a team? So if that's a financial advisor, alignment with your spouse, how do you do those things so that you don't get caught in a situation where you're over trusting or you're just investing in the first thing that you find? It's that patient stewardship and wise stewardship that I think ends up leading to positive results in the long run.
Yeah, Patrick, I agree that community is a huge component of that to provide encouragement, but also to allow you permission to take bigger risks and also make sure that a proper due diligence was done and that the fact that you've stepped in to provide a lot of that for investors sounds like it's just been incredibly fruitful in their lives and your own. And I'd love to hear more about who would be a good fit for a Keystone Investing community and what are your plans for the future as you expand into a multi-city model?
Yeah, totally. First and foremost, we're looking for investors that are values aligned. All of our investors today are faith aligned. That's our unique differentiator. We're not shy about that. We pray in meetings. We talk about how Jesus would think about our investing. We're open to folks who aren't faith aligned, but really we're looking for that mutual values alignment because we're building a community of folks. We want to know that somebody's going to fit culturally and values wise. That's number one above and beyond what we look for first. But then beyond that, from a regulatory perspective, we can only serve accredited investors. That's just unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you see it, the way that our country is set up, some of the compliance so that we can make sure that we're above board on that. So they have to be accredited. They're typically faith driven. They need to have liquid capital, right? So the intent to invest and the ability to invest in what is alternative investments are typically more risky than what you'd see in public markets. So we want to make sure they have that sort of appetite that if they were to lose that money, that it wouldn't ruin their life. We want to make sure they're in the right time of stewardship and phase of wealth, that would make sense. But then last but not least, I think part of our unique thing, again, is community. And so our typical members, they're in the city that we're in. They're eager to get to know folks. They're open to learning. And they're willing to carve out the couple hours a month to come to a meeting and meet people and consider deals. And so I think some of availability ends up being a key piece, or at least prioritization in some way. So that's our typical member. Again, right now we're in DC, Austin, and St. Louis. So those are where our core chapters are. We're currently in conversations about expanding that to several other cities. So we'll see what the Lord has in store. Ideally, and hopefully, God willing, by the end of the year, we'll be in at least a couple more. And so our vision and our goal is really twofold. How can we build these communities in locality in the United States in as many cities as we feel called to and as God calls us to, so that we can help in this formation of stewards, generous stewards, and help them along their journey. And then secondly, what we're building is more and more is how to encourage outside of just relationships and deals, but more like content and education and equipping. How do we help folks kind of go along that journey? What are the core concepts, things you need to know, whether practically or spiritually, to kind of support that journey? So we're building out more and more of that, and we're adding more products to our mix. So we've got angel deals. We've done some syndication. We're thinking about launching a fund to run alongside the network at some point. And so we're finding new and more ways to have folks get involved and participate in deals and just trying to serve our customers as best as we can.
Well, Patrick, we've covered a ton of ground. I'd love to hear what you're most excited about when you think about the next 5 or 10 years.
Well, as I mentioned, I'm very excited about that vision for Keystone and kind of seeing the growth. One thing I've noticed, though, is I think there's a move of the Spirit going on where people are waking up and saying, man, I think God cares about my vocation, cares about my business, cares about my investing. And yes, there's then the growth of content. And we're very thankful to folks like Faith Driven Investor Praxis, and others for pushing out content that's inspiring a lot of folks. But I think people, like I've heard a number of stories, one in particular, of a guy who ran his business for 20, 25 years, sold it. And then 6 months after selling, he woke up one morning and just really with strong conviction that he had not run his business according to his faith, and that he wanted to take the next 15 years of 20 years, whatever he had left in his life, not to try to like rewrite the ship or to try to like make amends, but he just had a shift overnight. After being an entrepreneur for 30 years, he hadn't learned it during that process, but God changed his heart. I think I'm really excited about the growth of this movement. That's not just the people that are flooding in and the different people that are thinking about new ways in which to do this and thinking deeply about it and coming up with new solutions and offering new things. And the entrepreneurs who are saying, man, I really want values aligned, faith aligned capital on my cap table. All of that is good and right, and it's going to continue to grow. But God is adding people to the mix by the day in ways in which we haven't even yet seen. So I'm very excited about that. I'm really excited about some of the transformation that's going on in the missions world around, hey, as a traditional missionary, if I go to a hard to reach country, they're probably going to kick me out. And I also have a hard time getting integrated into community. I have a hard time meeting people. When you talk about, hey, I'm going to go start a business in a hard to reach country, I'm going to bless my community, I'm going to get to know people, and also I'm going to provide value such that it's so that I can stay. Man, that's really exciting to see the gospel go to new places in sustainable ways. So I'm really excited about those two things in addition to our vision for Keystone.
Patrick, if someone's listening right now and they want to learn more about the communities through Keystone, where can they go to find more?
Yeah, the best place is our website. That's keystone-investing.com. You can also find us on LinkedIn. You can find me on LinkedIn, Patrick Farrell. Again, feel free to reach out. We'd love to share some of our resources or invite accredited folks who fit our profile to come attend a meeting and just check out our community and whether they're even in a position where they can invest or not. Sometimes coming to a meeting can spark inspiration as to what's possible. So we love to host guests who are aligned. But yeah, the website and LinkedIn are probably the two best places to find us.
Well, Patrick, as we get to the end of the episode, I want to leave some time for our Manager's Minute. We like to end every episode with just a practical action our listeners can take to step into their role as stewards and manage God's wealth wisely. Do you have a suggestion for our listeners today?
Yeah, I think my suggestion is going to be really simple, but particularly hard, which is that the first step on the stewardship journey is recognizing that all of your capital is God's. It all belongs to Him. And so therefore, it's what does God want to do with His capital, not what do I want to do with my money. If you start there in that position of surrender, I'm so confident that God will do the rest. That's the one simple practical thing that I would recommend. You probably had a lot of people on the podcast talk about that, so I don't need to harp on it, but it's such a simple first step. The other thing I would say, in case that one's too basic for you, is I think it also starts with alignment. What does it mean to be aligned with my faith as it relates to my investing? And that's relationally, but also in my investments. So a lot of times people are like, where do I start? And it's like, well, do all of your investments today align with your values? And what folks like Eventide and Sovereigns and some of the solutions that they have in market have taught us is that, hey, a lot of the public companies that we invest in and we don't think about it, they're actually doing things that we wouldn't approve of. And so that alignment's key. Is your financial advisor at least values aligned, understands your plan, understands your goals, wants to get to the same place that you're going to get to? If they're not, that's a big problem, right? And then lastly, like, what about your spouse? Are you guys aligned as to like where God wants to take your finances? Those are some easy steps that I think will really start and kick off the journey. And by the way, those are hard questions that you'll wrestle with across the entire journey. So you're not going to get it right off the bat. You're not going to figure it all out tomorrow. Those are journey questions. Is it all God's? And am I surrendering it all to Him? And am I fully aligned in relationship with those around me who I'm stewarding wealth with? Those are the two big questions that I think any investor is going to have to check themselves with over time. So hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, having walked through those questions myself over the past few years, I can't agree more that those are incredible starting places to pray on, to journal on, and to start to take action on. Patrick, this has really been fun hearing from some of your early years all the way up to what you're working on today and what you're excited about for the future. We're super grateful for your steps of obedience over the years and for taking some time out of your day to join us here. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure, and I'm really appreciative of the work that y'all are doing to highlight what it means to be generous. The steps y'all have taken personally to be exemplars in that category. I'm super thankful for you guys, and it was a blast to be on here. So I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for listening to the show, guys. If you want to find any of our references or links from today's show, you can always find them in our show notes at finishlinepledge.com/episode 190. And if you'd like to get in touch, we'd love to hear from you. Just send us an email at hello@finishlinepledge.com. Now, as most of you know, on the Finish Line podcast, we're all about stories, seeing how God draws us into generosity over a lifetime. But sometimes these stories can leave us thinking, what's the next step for me? That's exactly why we've launched a whole new podcast called Applied Generosity, which explores the full landscape of the generous life across 7 different dimensions. Applied Generosity helps make sense of the hundreds of stories we've shared on the Finish Line podcast to help you find your best next step. If you've been inspired by some of these stories and want to take things to the next level, check out Applied Generosity anywhere you listen to podcasts or at appliedgenerosity.com. That's it for today. We'll see you next time.